Hello, my name's Shai, and I shaded this model as a game-ready asset. You might expect this to be texture painted, but we can see that it's a fully procedural node tree. Because it's procedural, I can change the height and rotation of these lines and details, and I can change the influence of a noise texture to increase the paint weathering effect. And this whole system allows me to shift hues and get any look I want by changing just the parameters, which is way more challenging to do with texture painting. And the main reason I used a procedural technique as opposed to just texture painting is because it was so much quicker for me. As you probably know by now, I'm used to developing things procedurally rather than doing manual and destructive work. And like the user interface video, I started by pixelating my object coordinates. And I kept the snap value at a consistent scale to keep all of the parts cohesive. And all the rest of the nodes are contributing to some layer of the shader. That includes the ambient occlusion, glass textures, gradients, scratches, and smaller details that help tell a story, like vines growing on a tree, or leaves turning orange. But that's enough rambling. Let's see some practical techniques I implemented to make these shaders. I'll start by going over some of the tricks I used to emulate the texture paint style for this tree. To go for the bark effects, I used this distance node to get a spherical gradient, which originates from the base of the tree. I then used some math nodes like multiply and sine to get this wavy effect, and after tweaking the gradient, I used this as a mix between two different wood colors. I kept this effect pretty subtle, but I made sure the bark looked like it's visibly conforming around the branches. Next, I used Voronoi distance to get this vine mask. I made the vines pretty thin using a map range node, and I used the z-axis as a thickness input, meaning the vines become smaller than the pixels near the top. And the rest of this is pretty straightforward. I added some other details like extra noise for variations on the tree bark, and some especially dark spots, and I repeated a very similar process to get these leaf variations. Once you understand how to layer these effects with each other, it's not too difficult to make a procedural shader like this one. And of course, all of these shaders are generated without any image textures. Let's get on to the main idea for this car shader. The base of the material is made by adding dirt to the bottom of the car and using ambient occlusion to darken concave areas. To add interest and realism to the dirt, it's spread closer to the wheels, which I made using this mask. And for the scratches around the car, they're really simple too. Just use noise plugged into a less than node and mix a weathered paint texture through. Then do the same for a metal texture. Next up are the stripes, which you can make really easily just moving around the axes to make a simple rectangle and fading it out at the end. The magic of this pixelation system is that you can keep your workflow entirely. As long as you start out using these coordinates instead of these, it will all work as normal. The wheels were pretty fun to make. Using a gradient texture, we can use some simple math nodes to get a radial effect, but I added more stylization by using length as a less than input. So these gray areas on the wheel look curved instead of straight, which is controlled through parameters. Next, I shaded these headlights. To make it, I used some simple masks and gradients, mainly trying to darken and lighten certain corners. I replicated this for the rear lights and colored them red. And finally, one of my favorite textures to make was the window. I started off with this specific reference image, since I really liked the baked-in glare effect. So I made this diagonal wave texture and added it to the gradient on both sides. I added some pretty simple noise and tried to make sure it didn't look like water. Now that we've covered most of the car materials, let's take a look at how I made this leaf system, since it's a bit more advanced. I first subtracted my texture coordinates by Voronoi to get this scatter coordinate system, and use a length node to add a circle in each cell. I also stretched the circles to make them look more like leaves, and added a larger shadow variant. Then I added random variation to rotate each cell up to 360 degrees. And with all of these systems in place, I can control the strength and range of the shadow. I also use the tree's origin to make a circle around it, which I can use as a mask for the leaves. I ended up doing this twice, so I can change the start and the end of the tree leaves. For reference, this is what I mean by the start and the end of the tree spawn. I can add to both of these at the same time to change the radius of the leaf scatter. Quick tip, you can find this location vector using drivers by pasting the x, y, and z location into a combined xyz node using the driver's copy and paste tool. This means we can produce a single vector showing the location of an object, which I used to shift this Voronoi leaf mask. And don't forget, as this shader needs to work in Godot, I baked down all the procedural textures into images. You can follow Ryan King's tutorial on this if you're interested. And that's about all the highlights I have for these shaders. Have fun with some of the techniques I used here and apply them to all kinds of things. These models were provided by Winston, who runs his own channel under the name West Films Co. It's a part of a video game he's making using Godot. Be sure to check out the West Films channel, link in the description.